So we are going to start the beginning of Unit 2, where Unit 2 is essentially a rehash of what you talked about in biology. When you took biology, it's the ecology and evolution and feeding relationships part of our course. It's a really important foundation because we're going to keep coming back to these ideas throughout the course of the course. This chunk that you're going to watch now is a combined lecture for chapters 3 and 11. They make sense to put together because chapter 3 talks about evolution and the creation of biodiversity, and chapter 11 talks about the human impacts on biodiversity. So that's where we're going to start. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about natural selection and the evidence for natural selection, which then is the key mechanism for evolution and how that influences biodiversity, which is a super important concept in this course. We're going to look at extinctions, introduce them in chapter 3 and talk about them in a little more detail in the next half of this. Talk about ecological organization, growth of populations, and identifying challenges, a really important thing in conserving biodiversity. So when we look at evolution, we can look at the Hawaiian Islands. The Hawaiian Islands are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and have been a really good case study for evolution happening in a natural way and then the impacts that humans can have on evolution. So as a result of human influences, about half the native bird species have gone extinct on the islands of Hawaii. So it's unfortunate, but we have a way to study it. So the Aki, this guy right here, is one of 18 different species of honey creepers that came from one ancestral species that made it to Hawaii millions of years ago. And we're going to look at those ancestral species in a little while because each has its own set of unique characteristics. Bill shape is one of those characteristics. And you'll see why that happened and what that has to do with the environment. So this kind of honey creeper is a nectarivore. So it eats nectar. So its beak is designed to get nectar. One of the big problems in Hawaii is that the native forests are being clear-cut for development. I don't know if you've ever seen real estate on Hawaii. A 2-bedroom townhouse is like $800,000, which is no land. It's super, super expensive. So a lot of the forests are being clear-cut for development. And then there are introduced species that have made their way to the Hawaiian Islands under human influences. First, the Polynesians that settled Hawaii, and then the Europeans. So that's those are the big reasons why the native birds are disappearing. So let's set a foundation. You need to know what a species is. A species is an organism whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So that way, when the offspring that they produce then can produce more offspring. The idea of producing fertile offspring is super important because you can cross a lion and a tiger and get a liger, but the only way you get a lion and a tiger is by breeding a lion and a tiger. A mule is a horse and a donkey. You don't get mules from breeding mules because mules can't breed. They're sterile. Okay? So that's the idea of fertile offspring. Fertile as in being able to produce their own offspring. That's the definition of a species. That's a super important definition for you to know. If you take a bunch of species that live in the same area at the same time, you call them a population. You can look at the Del Val population. So there's the Del Val population in the senior class. That's a population. You can look at all of the Del Val kids that are in Del Val in this current school year. That's a population. You can look at the population of deer in Alexandria Township, or deer currently, or deer in Hunterdon County, or the human population in Kingwood Township. It's the individuals of the same species living in the same area at the same time. So populations will change over time as changes in the genes, which we're going to talk about, change physical and behavioral characteristics, and that's called evolution. Okay, it starts in the genes and then makes changes either in appearance or behavior. The driving force for evolution is natural selection. So, in other words, there are certain characteristics that are favored over others. So if they're favored, that means they allow the organism to survive and reproduce. And if that organism with that trait survives and reproduces, then they're going to pass that gene on, and it's going to become more common in the population. All right. So the idea of natural selection is based on 3 ideas. First, organisms are constantly struggling to survive and reproduce. That is what you've probably heard as survival of the fittest. The organisms that have the best traits, the best characteristics for their environment are going to be able to survive and reproduce and then pass those traits on. Typically what winds up happening, the second one, is that organisms are going to produce more offspring that are going to be able to survive to maturity, to survive and reproduce, okay? And then this third one, individuals of a species vary in their attributes. Within a species, there are different characteristics, okay? Different phenotypes, biology, different phenotypes that get expressed based on genotypes, all right? So individuals of the same species all have some kind of differences, some difference in their characteristics. Natural selection came from Darwin is the one you hear about most often, but Alfred Russel Wallace was another guy who kind of talked about it. These attributes, these characteristics, are passed to offspring from their parents through genes. Genes are what carry the characteristics. So if there are genes or traits that allow organisms to survive and reproduce more, that is going to spread, as I had said before, through the entire population. It's going to become a more common phenotype through that population. That gene, that trait, becomes an adaptation because it allows that organism to survive and reproduce better than organisms that don't have that characteristic. So, all right, Mrs. Grady, why are we even bothering to talk about evolution? This is environmental science. There's a lot that connects evolution to what we know about in the world. So the spread of infectious disease or changes in the virulence or potency of a contagious disease is a study in evolution. What is it about this strain of COVID that makes it more infectious or less infectious, or turns it from a respiratory thing to more like a pink eye kind of deal? You can track changes in the strains of flu, which is influenza, HIV, which is the virus that causes AIDS, or other pathogens. Every time you get a flu shot, it's engineered based on the most prevalent strains of the influenza virus for that season. And then the other thing that's super important about evolution when it comes to human health and modern society is finding bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. When I was a kid, we used to get antibiotics prescribed for everything. And that has created a lot of what they call in the medical world superbugs, like MRSA, that do not respond to conventional antibiotics. So they are antibiotic resistant. So a lot of people who wind up with MRSA, where it doesn't get treated or cared for early on, it winds up becoming a bigger infection that requires hospitalization and intravenous antibiotics. So evolution is definitely a good thing that we need to be aware of. Okay, so where do these adaptations come from? There are changes in DNA that are accidental. They're called mutations. We've talked about mutations when we talked about those things in biology. Some mutations they have no impact on the organism. Other mutations have a larger impact on organisms. Those mutations give rise to those genetic variations that then, if they are advantageous, they become adaptations that wind up making their way through the population to allow those organisms to survive and reproduce. Another thing that helps to increase variation among members of a species, if they're sexually reproducing, we've talked about crossing over and independent assortment in meiosis, which we're not going to go back into, but you have a lot of variation from the two parents that then combines to create a wide variety of offspring as the result of sexual reproduction. Natural selection can cause certain features to go in certain directions. And we'll see an example of that on the next slide. So this is what we call an environmental pressure, right? So some organisms will adapt and change their behaviors or their physical appearance based on other organisms in their environment, okay? So one of the honey creepers is called the iiwi, okay? And the length of the beak, obviously it's a nectarivore, the length of the beak can vary based on the changes in the flower's nectar tubes, okay? So here's a distribution of iiwi, and this is the average beak length of the original population. We talked about the fact that members of a species vary in their traits. So some of the iiwi in this population have a short beak. Some of them have a really long beak, but most of them have your average length beak because that length beak allows them to survive and reproduce because they can get the most nectar. Okay. If the flower tubes are shorter, right, then these shorter beaked iiwi are going to have an evolutionary advantage, right? It's going to be easier for them to get the nectar out of the flower, which means they're going to have more energy, which means they're going to survive and reproduce and then pass that shorter beak gene onto their offspring. So because in this case the nectar tubes were shorter, the shorter beaks were favored. So there's a shift in the dominant phenotype, right? Or the prevalent phenotype, not dominant. A shift in the most prevalent phenotype towards the shorter beaks, okay? If there's something in the environment that makes it more advantageous for the flowers to have longer nectar tubes, okay, these guys with the short beaks over here are not going to be able to get enough nectar to survive and reproduce. But these guys with the longer beaks, or these guys with the longer beaks, are going to be able to get enough nectar to survive and reproduce. So guess what's going to happen? Those long beaks, those organisms with the long beaks, are going to survive, reproduce, and pass those traits on to create a shift in the most prevalent phenotype of this population to favor longer beaks. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. So if you take a look at this, this is the ancestral honey creeper right here in the middle. And different environments required different traits, okay? So you've got these seed and fruit eater honey creepers, right? If you're going to eat seeds, you need a really short, thick beak to provide enough force to crack those nuts open, and nuts and seeds open, all right? So if you had, a beak like this guy, this nectarivore down here, this beak is not gonna make it down here because they're not strong enough to open the seeds and the nut and the fruit, okay? So this beak shape allowed this organism to, and that those that look like that have that characteristic, to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on, okay? This guy, this guy wouldn't have made it, this bottom guy, this seed and fruit eater, wouldn't have made it if he's trying to get into flower tubes to get nectar because his beak is not long enough. So if there were organisms of this phenotype up here with the nectarivores, he's not going to survive and reproduce because he can't get the food to do that. Okay, so that's this idea of different selective pressures, different requirements of environments. Ooh, that turned out well. Requirements of environments created different adaptations, much like Darwin's finches. If you did any study of evolution, the history of evolution. We're not going to dwell on this too much, but sometimes you can have unrelated species who live in similar environments that develop similar traits. They call that convergent evolution, but we're not going to dwell, but it exists. We have done something called artificial selection or selective breeding. We've domesticated dogs, cats, and livestock. So if you take the dogs over here, right, Collie, Great Dane, St. Bernard, Chihuahua, they're all the same species, okay? But we have selectively bred dogs like the Chihuahua to be small for whatever reason. We've selectively bred the St. Bernard. We've crossed organisms who have the right coat color, the right fur thickness, the right body mass to be able to go and do what St. Bernards do, okay? So you can cross a Collie and a St. Bernard, or a Collie and a Great Dane, or a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. And you're still going to have they're the same species, okay? It's all Canis familiaris. So that's how we get Labradoodles and Peekapoos and Cockapoos and all that kind of stuff, because they are actually the same species. If you take a look at this is an ancient mustard. And from that, we have cultivated 4 common vegetables, 4 crops that we use: Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower. They're all related, okay? We have selected certain traits for like the size of the flower. So these are the number of sprouts, okay, is a lot higher here on the Brussels sprout than it is on the cabbage. So we have done this. It's not just nature that does it. So from all of these variations, these mutations and these adaptations, evolution creates biodiversity. This is a huge topic in this course. Biological diversity, or biodiversity, talks about the variety of life across all levels. All right. We currently have named about 1.8 million species on the planet, but the actual amount might be even higher. We're going to talk about why that is down the line. We have a Captain Obvious statement in some of these lectures. Here's your Captain Obvious statement. The process by which new species are generated is called speciation. Okay, there we go. We can tell that species have come and gone through fossils. Okay, so fossil is an imprint in stone of a dead organism. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of fossils. We're not going to dwell on it. You can analyze the rock layers, figure out how old they are to figure out when the organisms lived. And if you look at all of the fossils in all of the rocks around the world, we call that the fossil record. The fossil record gives us a lot of evidence in support of evolution. One thing you can find out through studying fossils is that the vast majority of species that have once lived on Earth have disappeared due to something called extinction. Extinction happens when the environment changes faster than the species can adapt, okay? So a lot of the native Hawaiian species are going extinct because the populations aren't very big and they're really specialized. So they don't really have much of a chance when you have predators like the mongoose down here that was introduced into Hawaii. They can't fight it off. They don't have the mechanism, the adaptations to fight it off, okay? There are species that are endemic to a region, which means they live in one place and nowhere else on the planet. So they are super vulnerable. So if there's anything that affects that region, it's going to affect all of the members of that species. And then you have island-dwelling species that are also vulnerable to extinction because they've been isolated and they haven't had to develop a lot of the mechanisms to defend against predators. One place that we're going to talk about in a little bit is Madagascar as a biodiversity hotspot. Lemurs, right, are a species. They're like lower primate. They are only found on Madagascar. So they are endemic to Madagascar, and Madagascar is an island. So they're extremely vulnerable to extinction because it's an island and they only live in one place. Over the course of time, Earth has seen mass extinctions. Okay, there's a natural extinction rate. It's called the background extinction rate. And over the course of Earth's history, we've had 5 identifiable mass extinction events based on changes in the fossil record that have wiped out, listen to this, anywhere between 50 and 95% of the Earth's species every time. The biggest one was about 250 million years ago at the boundary between the Permian and the Triassic. Okay, that was huge. That was caused by volcanism, which we're going to look at again in a minute. Some of the causes other than volcanism were the asteroid impacts, which you know about from the dinosaurs, methane releases, which changes atmospheric composition, and global warming. If you can't deal with changing temperatures either way, too hot or too cold, you're not going to survive. So we are currently in the throes of the 6th mass extinction, mostly due to human impact from human population growth. So research says that the extinction rate today is anywhere between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the background rate, and it's rising. So what are we doing to cause it? We are altering or destroying habitats. We're overhunting. We're overharvesting. We are polluting air, water, and soil. We are introducing non-native species, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And climate change is a thing. So let's look at ecology. Ecology is the study of the interactions among organisms, right? So it's the biotic interactions, but when we talk about ecology, we also bring in the abiotic interactions, right? How they interact with non-living things. So if we look at the levels of organization in ecology, you start with an organism, a single turtle, an individual thing. If you put a bunch of those turtles of that same species living in the same place at the same time, you get a population. So we talked about populations before. You can look at a community. A community is all of the different populations that live in the same place at the same time. So here in this bottom picture, you can talk about the fish and the coral and the crabs and the turtles and the sharks and the rays and the flounder and all of those things living in that area at that time. And there are people that are community ecologists and they study those interactions. And then if you take all of those communities and the abiotic, blast from the past, or non-living parts of the environment, water temperature, water depth, pH, air temperature, soil, pH, whatever, any of those things, you get an ecosystem. So you put all of the living and the non-living parts together and you get the ecosystem. And you can be an ecosystem ecologist and look at energy and nutrients flowing between them. And then if you take all of the ecosystems and put them together, you get the biosphere. It is all of the living things and habitats on the planet. Pretty cool. Each organism has its own habitat, has a relationship with its habitat, which is the environment in which it lives. And there's, any variety of those. And depending on the species, the habitat could be 3 1/3 foot by 3 1/3 foot plot of soil, or many, many, many miles of land, thousands of square kilometers or square miles of land. Okay. How they use their habitat, Captain Obvious, is called habitat use. Okay. Certain things work better for some organisms than others, and how those systems and methods is habitat use. Some organisms are able to move and are mobile, so they can choose their habitat through habitat selection. Organisms wind up playing a role in its community, and we talked about this in biology. An organism's role in its community is called its niche or its niche. I say it either way. And that's interactions with other organisms as well as using resources. So if the niche is narrow, they don't use a wide variety of resources, or they don't interact much with organisms, we call those niches narrow. Okay? It's a narrow niche. So those organisms are specialists. They kind of do a couple of things, right? They need certain qualifications, certain circumstances to survive. They're kind of high maintenance. All right. If you have a species that can use a wider variety of resources, we call those generalists. And that's going to be important a little bit down the line. Generalists versus specialists. We can look at how populations change. We're going to get into this more in the next unit. In another life, I want to be a demographer, where I study how populations change, and I track 4 key factors. So natality is birth rate, mortality is death rate, immigration with an I is when individuals move into the population, and emigration with an E is when individuals leave or exit the population. So if we're talking about natural rate of increase, you're going to look at natality minus mortality. Okay, natural rate of natural increase. However, you can look at the actual population growth rate by incorporating immigration and emigration in there too. I'm not going to make you guys do the math now. We'll wait till next unit, but this is how you do it. So populations can either be regulated or unregulated. If a population is unregulated, it grows through something called exponential growth, where the population increases by a fixed percentage every year. So it's 10% every year. All right. When you graph that, it becomes a J-shaped curve. You need to know that exponential growth gives you a J-shaped curve. Okay. Exponential growth is only occurring naturally in nature when the population is small, when there's not a lot of competition, and when the environmental conditions are ideal, when there's plenty of resources. Okay, so let's be this pigeon bird thing. Population is small, there's not a lot of competition, and there's plenty of space, there's plenty of food, there's plenty of water, there aren't many predators, okay? So this population of individuals is going to reproduce. Everything is happy, everything is good, let's just keep reproducing. So they reproduce and they reproduce and they reproduce and they reproduce. And you get this exponential J-shaped curve, okay? It's very unrealistic, extremely unrealistic to think that exponential growth is going to continue forever, because every population is constrained by limiting factors that limit the growth of a population. They can be physical, they can be chemical, they can be biological. Some of them are resource availability, temperature extremes, predators or parasites, disease, availability of mates, any one of those, okay? So these limiting factors determine something called the carrying capacity. You have to be able to tell me, it's another one of those foundational things, what the carrying capacity is. It's the maximum population size of a species that an environment can sustain, okay? And here's the carrying capacity. So exponential growth is going to happen until those limiting factors start to come into effect, to play a role, and then the population levels out. Okay? As the population levels out when it approaches carrying capacity, it goes from a J-shaped curve to an S-shaped curve. This is called logistic growth. Okay? Now, I have a problem with this graph, so I added my own on the next slide. This, to me, kind of looks like, all right, so they get to about here, and, the pigeon population gets together, and the pigeon president says, all right, guys, you know what? It's starting to get a little cramped. Some of our friends and family are dying off, so let's just slow down reproduction. I know we're hitting the carrying capacity, so let's just slow down. Yeah, no, that doesn't happen. They're not aware like that. So the next slide kind of gives you a better idea of what winds up happening. Okay, so here's your exponential growth. Carrying capacity actually represents, carrying capacity is actually right about here. Okay, somewhere in here. So what happens is population growth continues. It shoots over the carrying capacity. So they exceed the number of organisms of that species that the environment can sustain. So life up here is going to be awful. No food, no resources, no water, no mates. You're not going to survive. So the population overshoots the carrying capacity and then comes back down. Okay, so here we are in the trough below carrying capacity. Hey, we got more space. We got more food. We got enough mates. Let's have babies. So they come back up over the carrying capacity. They hit here. Oh no, there's not enough food. There's not enough mates. There's not enough water. So the population crashes, all right? So the carrying capacity, as I said, is the average, but the actual population size tends to oscillate, okay, around the carrying capacity. It doesn't just get up there and stop, okay? It overshoots and then undershoots. It's kind of important for you to understand. There are some limiting factors that are impacted by the density of a population. The density is the number of organisms in an area. And some exist independently of the density of the population. So density-dependent limiting factors are going to rise and fall with population density. So if you talk about the spread of disease, if you have a densely populated population, a lot of organisms in a small area, disease is going to spread more rampantly. If you have a lot of organisms in an area, predators are going to have a much better time getting those organisms, okay? Water, food resources are also density-dependent limiting factors. Density-independent limiting factors are limiting factors that exist regardless of the density of the population. So a tsunami comes through, a hurricane comes through. It doesn't matter the density of that population. If one of those natural disasters comes through, it's going to wipe out a portion of the population, no matter how dense or non-dense it is. All right, so that's the difference between those. Carrying capacities can change. So as things happen, carrying capacities can wind up changing. So if a forest fire comes through, carrying capacity is going to decrease for most of those animals. Humans, this is a great question. Humans tend to be less limited by the idea of carrying capacity, because we have the ability to engineer and alter our environment. So our carrying capacity is continuing to rise. But will it rise without stop? That's a really good question. We can look at life history. The theory of life history talks about how natural selection impacts reproduction, survival, and lifespan. So differences in how these different species invest in reproduction, in parental care, and then consequently, how survival changes as a result of those investments can be seen in survivorship curves. So this is one of the things that you need to understand, all right? So we got type 3 survivorship curves. Here you go, the green, the frog, okay? Type 3 survivorship happens when organisms produce lots of offspring, okay? So they produce a lot of offspring at a time, but they don't give them much care, all right? So coral, fish, most fish, frogs, that kind of thing. They lay a lot of eggs, right? So this graph tells us that the chances of survival are a lot less, right, from the beginning, okay, because their survival is due to chance. There's not a whole lot of parental care. So the frogs lay all of these eggs, and most of them get eaten up as prey for fish and other organisms. So the big die-off happens when they're young. And if you make it to middle to old age as a type 3 organism, you're in good shape. You got a really solid chance of survival, all right? These are also called R-selected species, right? They do really well in changing and unpredictable environments. So type 3, R-selected species, low parental care, low investment in the offspring. Type 1 survivorship, that's us. Here we are, the red line, the human. They have only a few offspring, but they really invest heavily in their survival, okay? If you look at this graph, survival is really high when you're young in the type 1 survivorship curve. And as you get older, you have a better chance of dying. Well, that makes a lot of sense, right? So the type 1 survivorship curve, they're also called K-selected species. K because they hang out around the carrying capacity. And they tend to be found in more stable environments. This is like an introduction to the second part of this. We are developing the earth and extracting resources to increase the rate of change of natural populations. So we're introducing species, which we're going to talk about. We're looking for ways to preserve that biodiversity. There are lots of organizations around the world and locally that work to protect land, get rid of non-native species, and do that kind of thing. By doing that, by preserving these natural ecosystems, it can be a source of income. Okay, so this idea is ecotourism. Hawaii, a lot of the Caribbean islands where you can go snorkeling, the Great Barrier Reef, it's a huge economic advantage to maintain natural biodiversity because people want to come see it. Climate change also poses a challenge when it comes to biodiversity. When temperature and rainfall changes as it's happening, you wind up having some shifts in distribution of organisms too. So above 13 degrees Celsius, the mosquito, colder than 13 degrees Celsius, the mosquito that carries the malaria virus, protist, can't live, right? So currently, this is a forest in Hawaii. Currently, roughly a quarter of this protected area is malaria-free. Okay? And most of it is above the 17 degrees Celsius isotherm. So higher than 17 degrees Celsius, you're going to get malaria. All right? At this point, with 2 degrees Celsius of climate warming, and we're at about, are we at about a degree? We're about a degree. There's not much above that, so malaria is going to be everywhere. in this. So it can definitely have an impact. All right, let's look deeper at biodiversity. We know where it comes from. Let's talk about conserving it and, frankly, why it's important to maintain biodiversity. So we're going to talk about biodiversity, benefits to humans, extinction, why we're losing biodiversity, threatened and endangered species, and we're going to talk about a little legislation. There's a few pieces of legislation that we need, or we're going to get two here in this lecture. So the case study for this chapter, and you guys are going to read about this. A road through the Serengeti. So the Serengeti is a national park over in Africa, and there are huge migrations of hoofed animals through the Serengeti as the seasons change from wet to dry and back. And there's a group of people that follow the weather patterns. They're semi-nomadic, so they don't really settle in anywhere. And this Serengeti is between Kenya and Tanzania. So Kenya's to the north, and this is Tanzania. Okay, so when they set this preserve aside, it has isolated these people in this part of Tanzania. They can't really get through major roads, so there's a lot of poverty up here. So the president of Tanzania said, hey, let's build a road. So let's cut this red road right through here to connect the people over here to like things over here. So if you look here, this black-brown line is wildebeest movement. So this road would essentially cut off the northern part of the Serengeti from the southern part of the Serengeti, which could be problematic. So we're going to block migration routes. You would have animals dying from traffic collisions. If you think hitting a deer is bad, try hitting a wildebeest. Poachers, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, would have really easy access to organisms to poach. And then you would have urbanization along the edges of the reserves. Gas stations, villages, all that kind of thing before you cross into the desert. Into the preserve. So the East African court said, nope, you're not going to do it. And instead, you can't build through it, but instead you can go around it. So this is what they've decided to build. But a new president said, hey, let's build a pipeline right through the Serengeti, which then created a lot of the same conversations. All right, we know what biodiversity is from our previous conversation, the variety of life all over Earth in a bunch of different levels, which we're going to talk about, and we know what a species is. So we can look at species diversity. Species diversity is the number or variety of species in an area, okay? So you can look at the species in an area, species diversity, and there are math calculations that you can do with this, but it's beyond the scope of our course. You need to understand these ideas, though. Okay, species richness talks about the number of species. How many different species do you have in an area? The higher the number of species, different species in the area, the greater the richness. Okay, so then you have to look at, of those species, if you look at the populations of those species, the number of individuals of those species, is there a dominant species, or are they all pretty much the same? Okay, evenness or relative abundance talks about how much the species differ in numbers of individuals. Is it mostly elephants? Or is it pretty evenly split between elephants and lions and zebras and that kind of thing? All right. Genetic diversity here, okay, talks about differences in DNA composition among individuals. This is why inbreeding is a problem, okay? Because there's too much genetic similarity, not enough genetic diversity. Okay, populations with little genetic diversity are more likely to be vulnerable to environmental change. They can't withstand changes as they happen. They don't have the variation to help them adapt. They don't have that mutation, okay, because they're too genetically similar. We're going to talk about that again and again and again, particularly as we get into the last unit of the course. Okay, we can talk about ecosystem diversity. All of the different ecosystems, communities, habitats, all of the biotic and abiotic factors, all of the variety on the planet. A more diverse ecosystem creates a more diverse biosphere. But biodiversity is not even, okay? Some of the groups include more species than others, okay? So it's not even in that way. Most of the organisms on the planet are animals. Okay, of those animals, 2/3 of them are insects. Yeesh. Of the vertebrates, okay, the tiny little sliver of this pie that are vertebrates, half of them are fishes. Okay, we are less than mammals, not humans. Mammals are less than 10% of all of the vertebrate species. Okay, so yeah, insects are going to rule the world one day. We can also look at the variation in biodiversity based on location, okay? Species richness or variety in the kinds of species increases as you get closer to the equator. It's called the latitudinal gradient in species richness, but you don't need to know that, all right? So if you look at why that is, let's look at why that is. There's more land at the equator, if you really think about it. There's more solar energy, so it's warmer, okay? The tropical climates tend to be more stable. You know, you don't get much variation in temperature all year at the equator, and you don't get glaciation to disrupt environments. So those are the big reasons why you get greater species richness at the equator. And then the picture is going to show you that. So this is bird species, lower latitudes, closer to the equator, more birds, fewer birds at higher latitudes. Okay. And if you have diverse habitats, like in forests, you tend to have more biodiversity. So we talked about this. Why is it that we only know 1.8 million species, but there could be anywhere from 3 million to 100 million? A lot of them are really small and microscopic, and we haven't seen them. So that's why. Okay, why is biodiversity a good thing? Why bother? Okay. Regions that are really biodiverse have a lot of food sources that we may not know exist, or medicines that we may not know exist that could be really useful. So food sources, the amaranth, the capybara, okay, potential food sources. We're looking, when we get down the line, we're going to look at feeding the human population. And we're over 8 billion people, so the food needs to come from somewhere. Okay, so these are just some options that if we're not careful, we're going to lose these options, but we could lose even more that we don't know about. Okay, a lot of our pharmaceuticals come from wild plants. Okay, so malaria, one of the medications that you take when you have malaria is quinine. That comes from a plant. My mom, before she passed from cancer, was on a drug called Taxol, which really helped increase the quality of her life in the time that she had left. Okay, so a lot of these natural plants provide us with pharmaceuticals. We lose these plants, we lose these compounds that are important in medicine. Something else you can do is bioprospect, right? You can look for organisms that could provide food or medicine or other things that we need. There was a hokey movie in the 80s or the 90s, Medicine Man, Sean Connery. He was a bioprospector and was looking to save, had to be the 90s, because he was looking to save the Amazon rainforest, to save, this plant that was probably a cure for cancer or some other disease. More ways that we can use medicines. Organisms for medicines. Okay, in chapter 1, we talked about ecosystem services. Ecosystem services is another one of those topics that's going to keep coming up and up and up. Ecosystem services are things that naturally, normally, fully functioning ecosystems provide for us as humans. It's the greedy part of things, right? So biodiversity, a fully functioning ecosystem, provides all of these things for us: pollination, genetic diversity, climate stabilization, even the kumbaya stuff, right? The cultural and aesthetic benefits that we talked about when we talked about ecosystem services. We need to preserve ecosystems so they do the things that we need them to do so we can survive. In the next chapter, we're going to talk more about this. But if you have a lot of biodiversity in an ecosystem, it helps to increase the resilience of an ecosystem. So how it withstands a disturbance when something comes in, like a tornado or a flood or a drought or a fire, anything like that, how it's going to withstand that, recover from it, or be able to change, okay? We're going to talk about keystone species and ecosystem engineers. Beavers are an ecosystem engineer. The African elephants are as well, because they stomp on the tree seedlings, right, to keep them from growing. So when you have removed them, the elephants are not tromping on the tree seedlings, so what winds up happening is that they grow into scrub forests, which then changes the ecosystems and the biomes, which we're going to talk about in the next couple chapters, on the earth, which is not good. It's changing ecosystem diversity. Biotourism, again, is another way. Ecotourism, sorry. It's good for Hawaii. It's also good for Tanzania. It provides jobs and income. Edward O. Norton came up with this idea of biophilia. He talked about humans sharing an instinctive love for nature, okay? I wouldn't necessarily be as happy as that girl holding a chameleon, but I know that being outside in the wilderness, in the air, brings me a sense of peace and reduces stress. Even just sitting on the front porch and being out in the fresh air is helpful. So that's another reason why biodiversity is a good thing. From an ethical standpoint, some people think that organisms have the right to live just because they exist. They call that a biocentric or ecocentric view. If you believe that, then conserving biodiversity is important just for that reason, because those organisms have the right to live. So when we look at losing biodiversity and extinction, there are certain organisms that will wind up winning, in air quotes, and losing as the world changes, okay? When humans get their fingers on things, we reduce that diversity, okay? We tend to make ecosystems so that they're more similar, they're more open, and there tends to be more pollution. So in that area where the change happens quickly and there's not a lot of diversity, this is going to favor the generalists, right? Who have a wide range of places to live and niches and ways to interact. And then the organisms that are more specialists that rely on a mature, stable ecosystem are not going to be able to survive. So if we take a look at this, your winners, like the mouse, are going to be lower on the food chain. Generalists are selected type 3, quick reproducing. They don't need a lot of large habitat, okay? And they're really flexible. Your losers tend to be the K-selected, the type 1. Tigers, lions, elephants, organisms that need mature, dense habitat, okay? They're really specialized in their habitats, okay? Humans are type 1, but we have the ability to engineer our environments in a way that no other organism on the planet does. Populations are declining, so when a population shrinks, it loses its genetic diversity, and it also loses its geographic range. It goes from being widely spread to more narrowly spread, which then it's like something we're going to learn about. It's a positive feedback loop. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. It's just going to make things worse. The United Nations has quantified the biodiversity, and they compare it to a baseline from 1970, and overall the index has decreased 60% since 1970. It's not that long. It's 50 some odd years, but it's definitely getting worse. If we talk about extinction is when the last member of a species dies and the entire species ceases to exist. There are no more. It has been eradicated from the planet, right? That's permanent. You can't fix that unless you do Jurassic Park kind of stuff, but science fiction versus science, okay? Extirpation is the loss of a species from one area, but not the entire world. So the picture on the right, the orange, which is here, okay, all this orange, is where the black rhino used to be. The black rhino is now currently located in these red spots, okay? So the black rhino, for the most part, has been extirpated from sub-Saharan Africa, right? So it's really not here anymore, but it is not extinct because it does exist in some places. Not many, but it's there. We talked about the background extinction rate. Spoiler alert, we are responsible for most of it, okay? There have been mass extinction events. Here's the Permian Triassic that we talked about before. 90% of the species disappeared due to massive volcanism and then a subsequent warming of the earth. Okay, crazy that happened. And we are in the midst of the sixth, many scientists believe, due to human impact. There's a really good book, if you're interested, called The Sixth Extinction that gives a lot of evidence for it. It's a really easy read, too. It's not super heavy sciencey, very accessible. So we are, these are some of the extinct or endangered birds in North America. Currently, our extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times greater than that background rate. So the IUCN maintains a red list, and this is what the most current IUCN red list has on it. A quarter of mammal species, 14% of bird species, 40% of gymnosperm or like evergreen species, and 40% of amphibians are threatened with extinction. Yeah, organisms that existed that now no longer exist. Okay, so why is it happening? Why are we losing biodiversity? What's the cause? Well, there's a really nifty acronym that you're going to need to remember to help you remember the main factors leading to a decrease in biodiversity. It's HIPCO. HIPCO is habitat loss, invasive species, human population growth, pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. Overexploitation is also known as overuse. Okay, so let's take them one at a time. Habitat loss, okay. So we're clearing land to build housing, like you see in this picture. This jungle, this forest has been clear cut to build what looks like a resort of some sort. Okay, so it's either for development, grazing, farming, damming rivers, anything like that. Normally what happens in habitat loss, it's not a clear cut like that. It's really gradual, piecemeal breaking of the habitat. And it's called habitat fragmentation, right? So you've got this big, huge swath of habitat. And then you take a little bit out here for a housing development and a little bit out here for a mall. And here is a bigger housing development, okay? So what you wind up with are small chunks of old habitat with like islands among a sea of development, okay? So organisms that needed this big swath of area to survive, like a tiger, are not going to be able to live here. So they either need to move or they die, all right? So the highway through the Serengeti would have caused a tremendous amount of habitat fragmentation. That whole northern loop of the migration would have been cut off. We're going to talk about pollution, all this kind of pollution, air pollution, noise and light pollution, water pollution, runoff, which becomes water pollution. There are persistent organic compounds that stay within ecosystems and people that cause extinction. And then plastic in the ocean. We're going to talk a lot about all of these things down the line. So they're also reducing the habitat hospitality, for lack of a better term, and making it difficult for organisms to survive, which then decreases biodiversity. Human population growth, okay? So our population is growing bigger, but it's not so much that the earth is not big enough to sustain us, okay, because it is. We are not living smartly, okay? We are definitely not living sustainably. We're taking things faster than they grow back, okay? We have this consumption mindset. So we're killing gorillas, we're overfishing, we're killing sharks, you know, we're chopping down trees for various reasons. So we're a major part of that. This is the idea of poaching that we talked about. Hunters go in, they don't want the whole elephant, okay, because the whole elephant isn't valuable, they just want the tusks. So they kill the elephant, they chop out and take the tusks. This is a raid of African elephant ivory that was taken from poachers. So, yeah. And it typically happens more with the case-selected species. Invasive species, okay? We're going to talk a lot more about invasive species in the next chapter, but these are some examples, okay? The invasive species are non-native and they're introduced and they have no natural predators and they take over. So we know about the emerald ash borer around here. We know about the spotted lanternfly around here. The emerald ash borer has caused so much destruction to our native forests, okay, to the ash trees that have then fallen and caused issues with power and house destruction and car destruction, and it's just made life pretty miserable. When I was getting my master's degree at Mississippi State, we talked about kudzu. Kudzu was a vine that was introduced to prevent erosion in road cuts in the 1930s, but it took over. So it's this vine that covers everything. Another thing that's causing an issue is climate change. Animals are shifting their ranges, right? So as the temperatures warm If you live at the equator, you're an organism that lives at the equator, you're going to migrate north or south of the equator to find the right temperature for you and the right conditions. Or you might change altitude. You might go up the side of the mountain in order to find the right conditions. However, if we have organisms at the poles, they are not going to have another place to go. There's no place colder than the poles. So they're vulnerable to extinction at this point and loss of biodiversity. So polar bears at the North Pole, like this guy, they have no place to hunt, so they will raid human settlements. They'll get into trash cans and interactions with people and pets and all that stuff because they have nowhere else to go. So what can we do? What's a solution? We can create protected areas. So you can create preserves based on the organism you're trying to save. Do you make a big single preserve like the Serengeti, or do you make a bunch of little preserves based on what you're trying to save? If it's a K-selected species, you're going to want a bigger area of land. R-selected species, you don't have to be quite as nitpicky. You could create these habitat corridors. It's like an overpass for animals that allows them to continue their migration even though there's a road there. And it reduces the number of car traffic collisions with those animals. Promoting sustainable land use, being smart about using your land. We're going to talk about that a little more down the line. And then restoring lost habitats, putting things back the way they were. All right, legislation. We are looking at conserving endangered species, okay? There's a U.S. law. It's called the Endangered Species Act. It protects species that fall within two categories. The first is endangered, okay? Endangered means the species is in danger of becoming extinct in the near future. The other thing is, the other classification category underneath the Endangered Species Act is a threatened species. It's likely to become endangered soon. So it's a step before endangerment. The Endangered Species Act says that neither the U.S. government nor private citizens can do anything to destroy individuals within a species that's on the endangered species list. Okay? As of 2018, there were close to 1,600, if not a little bit more than 1,600 organisms on the list that were endangered or threatened. But they stopped funding for the Endangered Species Act in 1992, so there are probably a lot of species that should be on there but have not been on there. A real common argument against the Endangered Species Act is that it puts the survival of organisms ahead of a person's well-being and livelihood. So loggers, I remember this very clearly in high school, loggers in the Pacific Northwest were protesting the Endangered Species Act because they were told they had to slow down their timber harvest because of two endangered species in the old-growth forests, the northern spotted owl and the marbled murrelet. Okay, so that said, no, they were protesting, no, you're taking money from my kids' mouths. However, it doesn't, depending on how you approach it, it doesn't necessarily have to stop projects. Okay, it's not a halting piece of legislation if you approach it the right way. The Endangered Species Act allows for habitat conservation plans. So if you have a plan that will harm some individuals of a species, but if your end goal overall is to improve the habitat, they're likely to let you go ahead with it. Okay. The Safe Harbor Agreement says that if the government's not going to pursue additional action, if the landowner makes efforts to assist in that species recovery. You do something, you mess up, but you're going to fix it and you're going to make it better, then the government is less likely to come after you. So that was a U.S. act, okay? We have treaties that are international, okay? conservation of biodiversity is so important that there are international treaties to protect it. This one is called, same year as the Endangered Species Act, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. You can just call it CITES, okay? It bans the international transport of the body parts of rare species. So it bans the ivory trade and anything like that from crossing international borders. All right. There's another international treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity that gives funding and incentives to developing countries that make the environmentally sound choices to conserve biodiversity. Okay. So they've invested in Serengeti National Park and sustainable crops and all of these kinds of things to maintain and improve biodiversity. Something else that we're doing, we are using captive breeding. So we are taking individuals from the wild, breeding them in captivity, and then releasing their offspring back into the wild. Okay. Sadly, there are 65 plant and animal species that are only found in captivity now. That makes me really sad. The California condor is one of those success stories of captive breeding. There were 20, I really clearly remember this in school. There were only 22 California condors in the wild. They captively bred them and have released over 200, almost 270 into the wild. So the population has gone up quite incredibly as a result of captive breeding. Something else, this is the cloning idea. This is very Jurassic Park. You can take DNA from endangered species and insert it into an egg from a related species and implant it into a female. So it's cloning. And you can do that from DNA in preserved body parts. Like I said, a little Jurassic Park for my taste, but it's coming, potentially. We use forensic science to help figure out where body parts have come from, and then that assists in the upholding of the Endangered Species Act, or CITES. We can talk about two different kinds of species two different ways that we can protect species. You can protect something called an umbrella species, which has a huge range. So if you protect the wildebeests in the Serengeti, you're going to protect a lot of other organisms in addition to the Serengeti. The wildebeests. And then you can make the plight of certain organisms more well known by making them a flagship species, such as the panda. The giant panda is the flagship species for the World Wildlife Federation. We talked about biodiversity hotspots a little earlier. The regions that support a whole bunch of organisms, a lot of biodiversity, that are endemic, okay? At least 1,500 endemic plant species and having already lost 70% of the habitat area. So, most of Southeast Asia, Japan, Brazil, Central America, okay, Atlantic Africa, there's Madagascar, the whole New Zealand, and the ring-tailed lemur is one of those species that we had talked about before. We can set up parks and preserves to protect habitats and ecosystem services, to allow those ecosystems to function regularly. You may have some illegal stuff happening there, but at least it's set aside, and there are people there to protect it. They also set parts of the ocean aside for that, marine reserves. We're going to learn about that a little bit later down the line. And you can also put ecosystems back the way they were before we started to mess with them. And there's an example, okay? Getting community involvement. You're using local people to buy in to the idea of ecological restoration. And that's the idea of community-based conservation, getting people on the ground, grassroots efforts to get us back into where we need to be to maintain that biodiversity. So there ends chapters 3 and 11.